Hey guys. Tonight we're traveling back to the steppes of Central Asia in the 12th century, a place so windswept and unforgiving that modern comfort feels like a distant fantasy, and we're following the rise and catastrophic fall of the Mongol Empire, from a single boy named Temujin, who had approximately zero advantages in life, to an empire that would eventually span more territory than Rome ever dreamed of. And then we're watching it all crumble in ways that historians still argue about today. So settle in, because you probably won't survive this journey if you were actually there. What with the constant warfare, the dubious food preservation techniques, and the fact that every political disagreement seemed to end with someone getting trampled by horses. But from the safety of your bed, you'll experience all the drama without any of the frostbite or dysentery. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because I'd rather have a smaller audience of people who actually appreciate this weird niche of historical storytelling than a massive one that clicked by accident while looking for cat videos. And now that we've established our parasocial boundaries, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, starting with the Mongolian plateau in the 1160s, where you're standing on an endless grassland that stretches in every direction like a sea frozen in shades of brown and green. The wind hits your face with enough force to make your eyes water, and somewhere in the distance you hear the low thunder of hooves, because horses are absolutely everywhere here, not as a luxury, but as the fundamental technology that makes survival possible in this landscape. And you need to understand that the Mongols aren't a unified people yet. They're a collection of tribes with names like Tayechud and Merkit and Karait, tribes that spend about 60% of their time migrating with their herds, and the other 40% raiding each other for livestock, women and honor, which is apparently a finite resource you can steal. And into this world of brutal pragmatism, a boy is born around 1162, though the exact date is one of those scholarly debates where everyone has a different opinion, and none of them will back down. This boy is named Temujin, after a Tatar chief his father Yesugei had recently captured, which is sort of like naming your kid Steve, because you just beat up a guy named Steve. It's a flex, but also a crazy weird flex when you think about it, for more than 3 seconds. And Temujin's early life reads like someone specifically designed it to create either a world conqueror or a deeply traumatized hermit with trust issues. His father is a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, respectable enough to have multiple wives and a decent herd, but not powerful enough to be safe from rivals. And when Temujin is around 9 years old, his father arranges a marriage alliance with a girl named Berte from the Olkanud tribe, leaving young Temujin with her family to work as a kind of apprentice son-in-law, which is a normal practice here, where children are basically political chess pieces, and you watch Yesugei ride back across the steppes, feeling pretty good about securing his son's future, except he makes the catastrophic mistake of accepting food from a group of Tatars, who recognize him as the guy who killed their chief, the same chief Temujin was named after in that weird nominal flex, and they poison him, because the steppes operate on a very efficient revenge-based economy, where grudges compound interest faster than any medieval bank. Yasugi dies slowly and painfully, and suddenly Temujin's family finds themselves without a protector, in a world where unprotected families last about as long as ice cream in a Mongolian summer. The Taichu tribe, who were supposed to be allies, immediately abandon Temujin's family, and even try to kill young Temujin, because he might grow up to claim leadership. And you watch as this child, and his mother Holun, and his siblings get left to starve on the steppes, forced to eat roots, fish, and small game, basically anything they can catch with their hands, because they don't have enough horses or livestock to maintain the traditional nomadic lifestyle. And this is where most origin stories would end, with a sad footnote about a minor clan that vanished into obscurity. But Temujin apparently runs on spite and determination the way other people run on calories. His mother becomes this legendary figure of resilience, holding the family together through sheer force of will, and what the secret history of the Mongols describes as inspirational speeches that basically amount to "we're not going to die because I said so," which honestly is a parenting technique that deserves more credit. And during this period of extreme poverty and vulnerability, Temujin learns every lesson that will later define his empire. He learns that tribal loyalty is conditional and can evaporate the moment you show weakness. He learns that traditional hierarchies are just convenient fictions that people maintain until someone stronger comes along. And he learns that survival requires a combination of ruthlessness and strategic thinking that most people can't stomach. There's this incident where Temujin and his brother Kasar kill their half-brother Bektur over a dispute about hunting spoils, which sounds like typical sibling rivalry, until you realize it establishes Temujin's willingness to eliminate threats even within his own family. His mother is reportedly furious about this, delivering what historians believe was an epic guilt trip about how she gave birth to him, and this is how he repays her. But the deed is done, and the message is clear. Temujin is not someone who shares power, or tolerates challenges, and as he grows into his teens, he's essentially a refugee, surviving on the margins of steppe society. But he's also building a network. He remembers who helped his family, and who abandoned them, keeping mental notes like a particularly vindictive accountant. And this is where we need to talk about which is this Mongolian concept of sworn brotherhood that's more binding than actual family ties. Temujin forms an Anda relationship with a boy named Jamyuka, who will later become his greatest rival in a plot twist that absolutely no one saw coming, except everyone who's ever read any story about childhood friends. And there's also Togrul, the leader of the Karit tribe, who was an ally of Temujin's father, and young Temujin approaches him with what amounts to a very persuasive pitch about how helping the son of your old friend is both honorable and potentially profitable if said son happens to be nursing ambitions of greatness. And Togrul apparently looks at this scrawny teenager who's just walked across the steppes to ask for military support and thinks, sure, why not? What's the worst that could happen? Which in retrospect is hilarious, because the worst that could happen is Temujin eventually conquering most of Asia. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. With Togrul's backing, Temujin manages to rescue Berta, his betrothed wife, after she gets kidnapped by the Merkit tribe in a revenge raid for something Temujin's father did years ago. Because again, the steppes run on grudges that never expire. They're like the frequent flyer miles of violence, and the raid to rescue Berta is Temujin's first real military operation, and it's successful, which gives him credibility as a leader who can actually execute complex plans, though it's worth noting that Berta is pregnant when she returns, and historians have spent centuries awkwardly debating whether her first son Yochi is actually Temujin's biological child, or the result of her captivity, and Temujin himself apparently chooses to accept Yochi as his son, while also never fully trusting him, which creates family dynamics so tense you could cut them with a sword. And speaking of swords, let's talk about Mongolian military technology for a second, because you're probably imagining these warriors with gleaming steel and elaborate armor, but the reality is much more practical and terrifying. The Mongol warrior's primary weapon is the composite bow, made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew that take years to construct and can shoot arrows with enough force to penetrate armor at distances that would make European longbowmen jealous. Each warrior typically carries 2 bows and multiple quivers containing arrows with different tips for different purposes. There are armor-piercing arrows, there are whistling arrows used for signaling, there are even fire arrows for setting things ablaze because apparently regular arrows weren't problematic enough. And you watch these warriors practice from childhood, learning to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, a skill that requires the kind of hand-eye coordination that would make modern athletes weep. They can shoot forward, backward, and to either side without breaking stride, turning their horses into mobile weapons platforms, centuries before anyone invented the technical term mobile weapons platform, and the horses themselves deserve their own documentary. These are Mongolian ponies, short and stocky and capable of surviving on basically grass and willpower. They can travel vast distances without the kind of elaborate supply chains that European cavalry required, and each warrior typically has multiple horses, switching between them to avoid exhaustion, which means a Mongol army can cover ground at speeds that seem impossible to defenders who suddenly find themselves surrounded by an enemy that was supposedly 3 days' ride away this morning. And the stirrup, which seems like a simple piece of equipment, revolutionizes everything because it allows riders to stand and turn and shoot with stability, transforming the horse from a transportation method into a combat platform. Historians generally agree that the stirrup reached the Mongols from China via the Turkic peoples, though some scholars argue about the exact timeline and cultural transmission routes in the kind of nitpicky detail that makes academic conferences simultaneously fascinating and unbearable. And Temujin is absorbing all of this, learning not just how to fight, but how to organize and supply and motivate armies in a landscape where logistics could kill you faster than enemy swords. And he's also learning the art of psychological warfare, understanding that fear is a weapon as powerful as any arrow. And here's a quirky historical detail that doesn't make it into most textbooks. The Mongols practiced a form of ritual cursing, where they would symbolically shoot arrows at the sky or into rivers, while declaring their enemies doomed. It's part shamanic tradition and part psychological preparation, convincing your own troops that the universe itself supports your cause. And Temujin participates in these rituals while also maintaining a pragmatic approach to religion that basically amounts to, I'll take divine favor from wherever I can get it, but I'm not relying on it exclusively. And as he moves into his 20s and 30s, Temujin starts attracting followers through a combination of personal charisma, military success, and a revolutionary idea that you can join his group based on merit and loyalty, rather than tribal affiliation, which is radical in a society where your tribe is supposed to be your entire identity. He promotes based on ability rather than bloodline, elevating talented commoners to positions of authority and demoting incompetent nobles, and this meritocratic approach wins him fanatical loyalty from people who would never have opportunity. Under the traditional system, he's essentially disrupting the entire social order of the steppes, and not everyone is thrilled about this. His former and Jamuka emerges as the leader of a coalition dedicated to preserving the traditional tribal structure, and the conflict between Temujin and Jamuka becomes this ideological war between the old way of doing things and a new centralized model. They fight a series of battles where neither can quite gain the upper hand, and there's this haunting story about how they meet one final time, and Jamuka, knowing he's lost, asks Temujin to kill him without spilling his blood, which is supposedly an honorable death for nobility, and Temujin grants this request despite everything, having him suffocated or his back broken. Accounts vary, and there's something almost Shakespearean about these former friends who chose different paths and ended up destroying each other. And you're watching all of this unfold across the grasslands, where individual humans seem so small against the sky, where the wheel of fortune turns based on the outcome of cavalry charges and the loyalty of warriors who might switch sides if they sense weakness. And Temujin survives assassination attempts, betrayals, desperate winters where his people nearly starve, and he survives it all by being smarter, more ruthless, and more adaptable than his rivals. And by 1206, after decades of warfare and political maneuvering, he's managed to unite the Mongol tribes under his leadership. And the various chiefs and shamans gather for a kurultai, which is like a great council or parliament, but with more horses and fermented mare's milk, and they formally proclaim him Chinggis Khan, which we anglicize as Genghis Khan, meaning something like universal ruler or oceanic ruler. Scholars still debate the exact etymology, and this isn't just a new title, it's a complete reorganization of society. Genghis Khan breaks up the old tribal structures, reforms everyone into decimal military units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, cutting across old loyalties and creating a new identity based on the army itself. And he establishes a law code called the Yasa that covers everything from military discipline to property rights to religious tolerance, though unfortunately no complete copy of the Yasa survives, so historians reconstruct it from fragments and references in other texts, arguing endlessly about what it actually said. And one of the mainstream historical facts that everyone agrees on is that Genghis Khan established the first international postal system, the Yam, with stations across the empire where messengers could get fresh horses. And this system allows information to travel faster than ever before in human history. Intelligence about enemy movements, orders from the Khan, reports from distant provinces, all flowing through this network of riders who swap horses at designated stations and keep moving. And you're standing at one of these postal stations watching exhausted messengers arrive, gulp down some water, grab a fresh mount and disappear into the distance. And it's easy to romanticize this moment as the birth of something great, but you also need to remember that this unity comes at the cost of incredible violence. Tribes that resisted were annihilated, leaders who refused to submit were executed along with their entire families. Genghis Khan views mercy as a strategic tool to be deployed selectively, rather than a universal principle, and he's about to turn this newly unified force toward the rest of Asia, in campaigns that will make his early tribal conflicts look like practice drills. And the steppe is quiet tonight. The wind carries smoke from countless campfires where warriors sharpen their weapons and check their bowstrings, and somewhere in the largest tent sits a man who started with nothing, and now commands an army that will reshape the world. And you can feel the tension in the air, the sense that something enormous is about to begin. And if you were a farmer in northern China, or a merchant in Samarkand, or a prince in Kievan Rus, you'd want to enjoy these last few years of relative peace, because the Mongols are coming, and they're bringing a very specific brand of conquest that prioritizes efficiency and terror in equal measure, and as you drift towards sleep, you can almost hear the distant thunder of hooves across the grassland, a sound that will soon echo from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, and we'll pick up that story in just a moment. But first you should know that Genghis Khan's childhood trauma, and his rise from literal poverty to absolute power, created a ruler who trusted almost no one, and assumed that everyone was either an asset or a threat. There was no neutral position in his worldview, and that psychology will define every decision he makes in the coming decades, and the wind keeps blowing across the steppes, indifferent to human ambition, and you close your eyes and let the enormity of this moment wash over you. The strange historical accident that a boy named after a captured enemy would grow up to command the largest land empire in human history. And section 1 ends here, with the Mongols united and poised on the edge of world conquest, their horses restless, their arrows sharp, and their leader absolutely certain that the entire world is there for the taking, if you're willing to be ruthless enough to take it. You wake up now in 1207, metaphorically speaking, because you definitely didn't survive the previous section, and time travel remains frustratingly fictional. But here you are anyway, witnessing the Mongol Empire in its adolescence, that awkward phase where Genghis Khan has unified the steppes and is looking around for his next project, like a particularly ambitious student who's finished the homework and is now wondering if he should conquer the school. And the answer is yes. Obviously, he's going to conquer everything within riding distance, and then expand the definition of riding distance until it includes basically half the known world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. First, you need to understand the military innovations that make this conquest possible. Because raw ambition only gets you so far when you're facing fortified cities and armies that outnumber you 10 to 1, and Genghis Khan is, whatever else you want to say about him, a genuine military genius who understands that technology and tactics matter more than raw numbers. The Mongol army operates on principles that won't be fully appreciated by European military theorists for another 600 years. They use extensive reconnaissance, sending scouts ahead to gather detailed intelligence about enemy positions, supply lines, and political divisions, and this information flows back through the YAM postal system we mentioned earlier, creating what's essentially a medieval intelligence network that would make modern analysts nod in professional appreciation. And the Mongols are masters of the feigned retreat, where they pretend to flee in panic, drawing enemy forces out of defensive positions and into ambushes. It's a tactic that requires incredible discipline, because your own soldiers need to convincingly look like they're running for their lives, while actually maintaining formation and following a predetermined plan. And Western European chronicles are full of accounts of knights charging after fleeing Mongols, only to find themselves surrounded and slaughtered. And you'd think people would learn after the first dozen times this happened. But apparently pride and heavy cavalry don't mix well with tactical flexibility. And speaking of heavy cavalry, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the lack of elephants. Because the Mongol military philosophy is the exact opposite of the medieval European approach, where European knights are essentially tanks on horseback, wearing layers of metal armor and charging in formation with lances. The Mongols are light cavalry focused on mobility and ranged combat. They can ride circles around heavy cavalry, literally peppering them with arrows until the horses collapse from exhaustion, or the knights die from arrows finding gaps in their armor. And this difference in military doctrine explains why the Mongols can defeat larger armies. They're not fighting on the enemy's terms. They're imposing their own style of warfare. And here's where we need to talk about the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China, which begins around 1211 and demonstrates everything brilliant and terrifying about Mongol military operations. The Jin dynasty controls a territory that's home to millions of people. They have fortified cities with walls that laugh at cavalry charges. They have professional armies with crossbows and siege equipment, and they have a bureaucracy that's been running sophisticated logistics for centuries. And Genghis Khan looks at all of this and basically says, cool, I'll take that. And the Jin initially underestimate the Mongols because everyone underestimates steppe nomads right up until the moment those nomads are burning your capital. But the Mongols have a problem. They're fantastic in open field battles, but cities with walls are not their specialty. So Genghis Khan does what any reasonable person would do. He recruits Chinese and Muslim siege engineers who teach his armies how to build trebuchets, siege towers, and other equipment for reducing fortifications to rubble. And this is a pattern you'll see throughout Mongol expansion. They're ruthlessly practical about adopting enemy technology and expertise. There's no pride in doing things the Mongol way. if another way works better, and this adaptability is revolutionary in a medieval world where most societies are deeply conservative about military traditions. And the siege of Zhongdu, which is modern Beijing, in 1215 is a masterclass in combining traditional Mongol tactics with borrowed siege technology. The city holds out for months, the defenders are desperate, and when the city finally falls, the Mongols spend a month systematically looting it. And Chinese sources describe the destruction in terms that are probably exaggerated, but still deeply unsettling. And here's where we need to talk about Mongol terror tactics, because this is the dark side of their military genius. Genghis Khan understands that fear can make future conquests easier. If cities hear about what happened to places that resisted and immediately surrender, that saves Mongol lives and resources. So the Mongols deliberately cultivate a reputation for total destruction of anyone who fights back. Cities that surrender are generally treated well. They pay tribute and their populations are mostly left alone. But cities that resist and are eventually taken face massacre, enslavement and destruction so thorough that it serves as a warning to the next city, and this is calculated psychological warfare, not random violence, though that distinction probably doesn't comfort the victims much. And you're watching from some impossible vantage point as cities make this terrible calculation. Do we fight and risk annihilation? Or do we surrender and hope the Mongols keep their word about merciful treatment? And most cities surrender, which is exactly the point. And there's this grimly funny historical anecdote about how Mongol generals would sometimes execute everyone in a city and then send a messenger to the next city to describe what happened, basically saying this could be you, and it's effective marketing if your product is existential terror. And meanwhile, back in Mongolia, Genghis Khan is reorganizing society in ways that will outlast his military conquests. He's promoting literacy and record-keeping, commissioning the adaptation of the Uyghur script for writing Mongolian, because an empire needs administration, and you can't administer what you can't document. And he's establishing religious tolerance as official policy, partly because he's genuinely somewhat open-minded about spiritual matters, and partly because religious persecution creates unnecessary enemies, and the Mongols have enough actual enemies without adding theological disputes to the list. So you see this bizarre cosmopolitan court where Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian priests, and shamanistic practitioners all coexist and debate theology, while the Khan listens with what sources describe as polite interest. And this tolerance is remarkable for the 13th century, when most rulers assumed their god was the only real one, and everyone else was worshipping demons. And there's scholarly debate about whether Genghis Khan's tolerance was principled or purely pragmatic, and the answer is probably both. Humans are complicated and can have multiple motivations simultaneously. Shocking, I know. And during this period, the Mongols are also moving west, skirmishing with the Khwarezmian Empire, which controls much of Central Asia, and is by medieval standards pretty wealthy and powerful. And there's this incident in 1218 where a Mongol trade caravan gets massacred by the governor of Otrar, a Khwarezmian city, possibly because the governor suspects the merchants of being spies, which to be fair they probably are. The Mongols use merchants as intelligence gatherers all the time, but murdering the caravan turns out to be a catastrophically bad decision, because Genghis Khan sends ambassadors demanding the governor be handed over for punishment, and the Khwarezmian Shah, a man named Muhammad, who's apparently competing for the worst diplomatic decisions in history award, kills some of the ambassadors and sends the others back with their beards shaved off, which is a deliberate insult in medieval Muslim culture. And Genghis Khan receives these insulted ambassadors and reportedly declares that he'll make the Shah regret this, which is the understatement of the century, because what follows is a campaign of destruction so thorough that Central Asian urban civilization doesn't fully recover for generations. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm in 1219 brings somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 Mongol warriors. Accounts vary wildly, against an empire that should theoretically be able to field even larger armies. But the Shah makes the strategic mistake of dividing his forces among his cities rather than concentrating them, and the Mongols systematically take each city using a combination of siege warfare, psychological terror, and brilliant tactical coordination. Bukhara falls, Samarkand falls, the great cities of the Silk Road burn, and you're walking through the ruins of Samarkand in 1220, once a center of Islamic scholarship and trade, now a smoking wasteland where survivors hide in the ruins and wonder what happened. And the answer is that they resisted, and resistance against the Mongols carries a very specific price. And here's a quirky detail that shows the strange contradictions of this empire. Even while conducting these devastating campaigns, Genghis Khan is protecting artisans, scholars, and skilled workers, having them transported back to Mongolia, where their expertise can be exploited. So you have this weird situation where the Mongols are burning libraries while simultaneously kidnapping the librarians to work for them. It's pragmatic in a horrifying way, and the Khan's grandson Hulagu will later establish the Maragay Observatory staffed by astronomers captured during these conquests, and some of the astronomical instruments and texts preserved there survive specifically because the Mongols valued practical knowledge even while destroying everything else. And this selectivity in destruction is part of what makes the Mongol conquests so historically complex. They're not mindless barbarians smashing everything. They're very thoughtful about what they smash and what they preserve, which somehow makes it worse, and the campaign against Khwarezm also demonstrates Mongol operational flexibility. They split their armies and coordinate attacks across distances of hundreds of miles, using the Yam system to maintain communication. And this kind of coordinated campaign was nearly impossible for medieval armies that relied on slower communication methods, and the Shah Muhammad flees from city to city as the Mongols pursue him. He ends up dying on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and defeated, while his son Jalal ad-Din continues resistance and actually wins a battle against a Mongol detachment at the Indus River in 1221, which is notable mainly because Mongol defeats are rare enough to make the historical record, but even this victory is temporary. Jalal ad-Din is eventually hunted down and killed, and the message is clear: you cannot run from the Mongols. They will chase you to the ends of the earth if necessary. And this relentlessness is part of their psychological arsenal. And meanwhile in the east, Mongol armies are continuing operations against the Jin dynasty. And here we need to mention Mughali, one of Genghis Khan's most talented generals, who's left in charge of the Chinese campaigns, while the Khan is busy in Central Asia, and Mughali conducts a systematic reduction of Jin territory, not rushing, just methodically taking cities, and securing supply lines. And this two-front war is logistically insane by medieval standards. Most empires struggle to supply one army on one front. The Mongols are running multiple campaigns across thousands of miles simultaneously, and they make it work through superior organization and the aforementioned postal supply system. And you're starting to see the pattern here. The Mongols win not just through violence but through administrative innovation. They've turned warfare into a science. And Genghis Khan himself is aging now. He's in his 50s and 60s, which is elderly by medieval standards, especially for someone who spent his entire adult life on horseback fighting wars. And he's thinking about succession, which is a problem because he has 4 legitimate sons from Berta and various other children from other wives, and naming one of them as sole heir risks civil war from the others. And the solution he arrives at is a kind of confederation where his sons each get territories, but one of them, Ugadai, gets the title of Great Khan. And this compromise works for about 1 generation before causing exactly the civil wars Genghis Khan was trying to avoid. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the early 1220s, the empire is still expanding, still unified by the Khan's personal authority. And there's this fascinating campaign against the Western Shah kingdom in northwest China, which the Mongols had already forced into submission earlier, but which rebelled, and Genghis Khan takes this rebellion very personally, possibly because he's old and tired, and running out of patience for people who don't stay conquered. And the campaign against Western Shah in 1226 to 1227 is brutal even by Mongol standards, systematic annihilation of cities, and during this campaign Genghis Khan dies, probably from injuries sustained falling off a horse, though some sources suggest illness, and there are romantic legends about him being killed by a Western Shah, princess with a concealed weapon. But those are almost certainly folklore. The boring explanation of old man falls off horse and dies from complications is probably correct, and his death is kept secret for a period while his armies complete the destruction of Western Shah. Everyone who encounters the funeral procession is reportedly killed to prevent the news from spreading, which again is terror tactics even in death. And Genghis Khan is buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Mongolia. The location is lost to history despite centuries of searching, and this secrecy about the burial was deliberate, possibly based on shamanic traditions about protecting the Khan's spirit. And modern archaeologists occasionally claim they're close to finding it, but so far no one has. And honestly, maybe it's better that way. Let the man rest wherever he is. He changed the world enough while alive, and you're standing on the steps in 1227, the year of the Khan's death, and there's this strange moment of uncertainty. The empire has no precedent, no clear rules for succession, beyond what Genghis Khan decided, and for a moment it seems like everything might fragment back into competing tribes and kingdoms. But Ogedei takes power in 1229, after a Kurultai confirms him, and the empire continues, and in fact it continues expanding, which suggests that the Mongol system has become bigger than any one individual. It's become self-sustaining, and that's simultaneously impressive and terrifying. And we need to talk about the administrative systems that make this possible. The Mongols adopt a census system borrowed from Chinese practice, counting their subjects not just for taxation, but for military conscription and labor allocation. And they establish a relatively predictable tax system. If you're a farmer or merchant in the Mongol Empire, you pay your taxes and otherwise you're mostly left alone. There's less arbitrary confiscation than under many medieval governments, which makes Mongol rule somewhat tolerable for civilian populations despite the horrific conquest phase, and there's evidence that trade actually flourishes under Mongol rule because the empire is so vast and the roads are relatively safe. Caravans can travel from China to the Mediterranean under one political system, and this creates the conditions for cultural and technological exchange on an unprecedented scale. Gunpowder technology spreads westward, astronomical knowledge spreads in all directions, and this is the foundation for what historians sometimes call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which is a deeply ironic term given how the peace was established, but it's real, and merchants and travelers like Marco Polo will later take advantage of this connectivity, though Marco Polo's exact role and the authenticity of his account is another one of those ongoing scholarly debates that generates more heat than light. And here's a mainstream historical fact that everyone agrees on. The Mongols were responsible for the spread of the Black Death to Europe. Though unintentionally, their armies encountered plague in Central Asia and carried it westward, and the famous siege of Kaffa in 1346, where Mongol forces catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, is possibly apocryphal, but reflects the kind of biological warfare that could happen when armies carried diseases across continents, and the Black Death will kill something like a third of Europe's population, making it one of the most consequential disease events in human history. And it's a grim reminder that empires connect the world in ways both productive and catastrophic. And as Section 2 draws to a close, you're watching the Mongol Empire in the 1230s, still expanding, still innovating. Armies are pushing into Russia and Eastern Europe. Other forces are completing the conquest of the Jin dynasty, and the empire is becoming this vast multi-ethnic confederation held together by military power, administrative competence, and the lingering threat of what happens to people who rebel. And it's important to note that most people living under Mongol rule are not Mongols. The actual ethnic Mongol population is tiny compared to the empire's total subjects, which means the whole system depends on collaboration from local elites, Chinese bureaucrats, Persian administrators, Russian princes, all cooperating with the Mongol overlords in exchange for keeping their positions and some degree of autonomy. And this collaborative imperialism is different from the total replacement model, where conquerors try to remake society in their image. The Mongols generally don't care how you organize your local society, as long as you pay tribute and provide troops when requested. And this pragmatism is key to understanding how such a small population controlled such a vast territory. And you can feel yourself drifting now, the details of tax policy and military organization blurring together, which is perfect because we're transitioning from the brutal conquest phase to the complex reality of actually administering this impossible empire. And that's where we'll pick up in Section 3. But for now, just appreciate the sheer improbability of what you've witnessed. A collection of steppe tribes transforming themselves into a world power through a combination of military innovation, psychological warfare, and administrative borrowing from conquered peoples. And Genghis Khan's death hasn't stopped the expansion. If anything, the momentum is building, and the Mongols are about to reach their maximum territorial extent, and it's going to be simultaneously impressive and catastrophic. But that's a story for the next section, and for now you can rest in this moment between the great conquests and the eventual fracture, when the Mongol Empire seems unstoppable, when the sound of hooves echoes across 3 continents, and when the very word Mongol makes emperors and caliphs wake up in cold sweats wondering if they're next. You open your eyes, metaphorically, in the 1230s, and the Mongol Empire is hitting its stride, operating on multiple fronts simultaneously in a display of logistical coordination that would make modern military planners jealous. And under Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor, the conquests continue with even greater intensity. It's like someone gave a perfectly functional war machine a fresh tank of gas and pointed it at every remaining independent kingdom in sight. and we need to start with the campaigns in Eastern Europe, because they're simultaneously the most famous and most misunderstood part of Mongol expansion. In 1237, a Mongol army commanded by Batu Khan, who's Genghis Khan's grandson, crosses the Volga River and enters the Russian principalities, which at this point are a collection of competing kingdoms centered around cities like Kiev, Vladimir and Ryazan, and these principalities have the misfortune of being disunited and geographically positioned directly in the path of Mongol expansion. The campaign begins in winter, which is tactically brilliant because the frozen rivers become highways for Mongol cavalry, and the Russian forces discover that their home field advantage of "it's cold here and we're used to it" doesn't really apply when the enemy is from Mongolia, where winter is a competitive sport. The Mongols are perfectly comfortable fighting in temperatures that would kill most armies, and they have winter warfare down to a science: leather boots with felt linings, layers of clothing, and the knowledge of how to keep moving to avoid frostbite. And you're watching Russian princes try to coordinate a defense, but they can't agree on unified command. Each prince is worried about the others gaining too much power, which is the classic medieval problem, where immediate political competition overrides long-term survival concerns, and the Mongols exploit this ruthlessly, taking cities one by one, and the Russian chronicles describe the invasion in apocalyptic terms, comparing it to divine punishment, which is theologically interesting but strategically useless. And by 1240 Kiev, the cultural and religious center of Rus, falls to the Mongols, and the city is thoroughly sacked, churches burned, population massacred or enslaved. And when European travelers pass through a few years later, they describe vast fields of bones, which is probably exaggerated, but indicates the scale of destruction. And here's where we need to talk about the Mongol invasion of Poland and Hungary in 1241, because this is where the Mongols come closest to conquering Western Europe. And there's this counterfactual historical question that people love to debate. What would have happened if the Mongols had continued west? Could they have taken France, Germany, maybe even England? And the honest answer is, we don't know. But the Mongols certainly had momentum when they entered Hungary. They've just defeated a combined Polish-German force at the Battle of Legnica, where European heavy cavalry charges straight into Mongol feigned retreats, and gets slaughtered exactly like every other heavy cavalry force that tried the same thing. And in Hungary, the Mongols face King Bela IV, who's actually a reasonably competent military leader. He tries to concentrate his forces and meet the Mongols in open battle at the Saho River, and the Battle of Murhai in April 1241 is a masterclass in Mongol tactical doctrine. They've scouted the Hungarian positions thoroughly. They attack from multiple directions simultaneously, and when the Hungarians try to retreat, the Mongols deliberately leave one escape route open, channeling the fleeing army into a killing zone where they're massacred over several days of pursuit. And this tactical patience, the willingness to let the enemy run and then hunt them down systematically, is part of what makes Mongol victories so complete. They don't just win battles, they annihilate armies, and Hungary is devastated. The countryside is ravaged, and contemporary sources suggest that something like a quarter of the population dies, either from direct violence or from the famine and chaos that follows. And Bela IV flees to Austria and then to Croatia. And it looks like nothing can stop the Mongols from continuing into Western Europe. And then they stop. They turn around and ride back east. And Western European chroniclers credit this to divine intervention, or the Mongols being intimidated by European fortifications. But the actual reason is that Ugadai Khan dies in December 1241, and Mongol law requires all the princes and generals to return for the Kurultai to elect a new great Khan, and Batu Khan, commanding the European campaign, decides that being present for the succession is more important than conquering additional European territories, and this decision probably saves Western Europe from invasion, at least temporarily, and there's scholarly debate about whether the Mongols would have returned to Europe eventually, and whether they could have sustained campaigns in the more urbanized and fortified Western European landscape. But we never find out, because by the time succession is settled, other priorities have emerged, and the Mongol Empire never seriously threatens Western Europe again. And you're standing in the ruins of a Hungarian village in 1242, watching the Mongol armies ride east, and there's this weird sense of an alternate timeline closing, a version of history where Paris and London burn like Kiev burned. But that's not the timeline we're in, and instead the Mongols consolidate their control over Russia, establishing what becomes known as the Golden Horde, which will dominate Russian politics for the next 2 centuries. And Russian princes have to travel to the Mongol capital to receive patents confirming their authority, and they pay annual tribute. and this period becomes foundational to Russian historical consciousness, the Mongol yoke, that later nationalist historians will blame for everything from political authoritarianism to economic backwardness. Though modern scholars debate how much Mongol rule actually changed Russian development versus just reinforcing existing patterns. And meanwhile in the south, the Mongols are pressing against the Abbasid Caliphate, which is the theoretical center of the Islamic world. Though by the 13th century, the caliph's actual political power is pretty limited, but Baghdad remains a major city, home to hundreds of thousands of people, a center of learning and trade, and in 1258 Hulagu Khan, another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, brings a Mongol army to the walls of Baghdad, and the Caliph al-Mustasim apparently doesn't fully grasp the danger he's in. He thinks he can negotiate, or that the Mongols will be deterred by Baghdad's walls and the city's religious significance, and he's catastrophically wrong on both counts. The siege lasts less than 2 weeks. The Mongols have Chinese and Persian siege engineers who build trebuchets and other equipment, and when the city falls in February 1258, the sack of Baghdad becomes one of history's great urban catastrophes. Estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad's great library, is destroyed, and there's this famous story about the Tigris River running black with ink from all the books thrown into it, and then running red with blood, which is probably literary exaggeration, but captures the cultural trauma, and al-Mustasim himself is executed, reportedly wrapped in a carpet, and trampled by horses because the Mongols have this superstition about not spilling royal blood directly, which is a weird fastidiousness for people who've just destroyed a city, and the fall of Baghdad marks the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, an institution that had existed in some form for over 500 years, and the psychological impact on the Islamic world is enormous. If even Baghdad can fall, then nowhere is safe, and from the Mongol perspective, this is just another conquest. But from the perspective of Islamic civilization, it's a wound that doesn't fully heal, and modern historians argue about the long-term effects, whether the destruction was as total as described, or whether Baghdad was already in decline. But the fact remains that the city never fully recovers its former prominence, and Hulagu continues west, taking Syria, and it looks like he might conquer Egypt next, which would give the Mongols control of essentially all the major Islamic centers. But in 1260 a Mongol army is defeated by the Mamluks, who are the military slave dynasty ruling Egypt, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, and this is significant because it's the first major Mongol defeat in decades, and it establishes that the Mongols can be beaten. The Mamluk victory is partly luck. Hulagu has withdrawn most of his forces because of succession politics, back in Mongolia, leaving only a smaller force that the Mamluks are able to match numerically, but it's still a genuine military defeat, and it stops Mongol expansion in the Middle East. And here's a quirky detail. One of the key Mamluk commanders at Ain Jalut is Baybars, who will later become Sultan, and he's reportedly so dedicated to defeating the Mongols that he coordinates intelligence networks and diplomatic alliances across the region. And there are these great stories about messages hidden in bread loaves and secret signals, the kind of spycraft that rarely makes it into military histories, but is crucial to how wars actually work. And Baybars becomes this legendary figure in Mamluk history, proof that you can resist the Mongols if you're smart and disciplined and lucky. And the Mongol failure in Egypt creates a permanent border. The Ilkhanate controls Persia and Iraq, the Mamluks control Egypt and Syria, and they skirmish for decades, but neither can fully defeat the other. And meanwhile in East Asia, the Mongols are completing the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, which takes decades because the Song are wealthy and sophisticated, and have good defensive positions along rivers and in mountainous terrain, and the Mongols have to adapt their tactics, building a navy to fight river battles, which is hilarious if you think about it. Steppe nomads from landlocked Mongolia, constructing fleets, but they do it, recruiting Chinese shipbuilders and sailors, and learning naval warfare from scratch. And by 1279 the last Song resistance collapses, and Kublai Khan, who's the great Khan at this point, controls all of China, and this is the absolute territorial peak of Mongol power, an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, encompassing something like a quarter of the world's population. And it's important to note that this isn't really one unified empire anymore. It's becoming 4 distinct Khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, under Kublai, the Il-Khanate in Persia, under Hulagu's descendants, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. And these Khanates theoretically recognize Kublai as the Great Khan, but in practice they're increasingly independent, pursuing their own interests, and sometimes even warring with each other, which we'll get to in Section 4. But for now, just appreciate the sheer scale of what's been accomplished in less than a century, starting from the unification of the Mongolian tribes in 1206 to controlling the largest contiguous land empire in human history by the 1270s. It's a rate of conquest that has no historical parallel. Alexander the Great conquered fast but died young, and his empire immediately fragmented. Rome built a comparable empire but took centuries to do it. The Mongols did it in 3 generations, and the secret sauce is their combination of military excellence, administrative adaptability, and absolutely ruthless willingness to destroy anyone who resists while offering reasonable terms to those who surrender. And you're watching all of this from your privileged position outside time, seeing the big picture that individual participants couldn't see. A merchant in Samarkand doesn't know he's living through the rise of the largest empire ever. He just knows that taxes are different now, and the people in charge have different names, and you'd better not cause trouble. And a peasant in Hungary has no concept of what the Mongol Empire is. She just knows that horsemen came and destroyed her village and killed her family, and history is these individual experiences multiplied millions of times over, and it's easy to get lost in the strategic analysis and forget that every battle represents thousands of individual traumas. Every conquest means displacement, enslavement, death, and the survivors living under foreign rule. And Mongols are efficient conquerors, but that efficiency comes at a human cost. That's hard to fully comprehend, and yet at the same time, and this is where history gets complicated, the Pax Mongolica does bring some benefits. Trade increases, technologies spread, there's a degree of religious tolerance, unusual for the period, and if you're a merchant or scholar, your life under Mongol rule might actually be pretty good, assuming you weren't in one of the cities that resisted and got obliterated. And this is the fundamental tension in evaluating the Mongol Empire. Unprecedented destruction during the conquest phase, followed by relatively stable and even prosperous conditions under Mongol administration, and different historians emphasize different aspects depending on their methodological approach, and sometimes their own cultural background. And there's no simple verdict. History doesn't do simple verdicts, and here's a mainstream historical fact that bridges the conquest and administration phases. The Mongols were early adopters of paper money, learning the concept from the Chinese and implementing it across their empire, creating what's essentially the first large-scale fiat currency system. And this requires a degree of economic sophistication that doesn't fit the primitive nomad stereotype. You need to maintain the currency's value through state authority and trust. You need to prevent counterfeiting. You need to ensure merchants will accept paper instead of metal coins. And the Mongol Yuan government manages this for several decades before inflation and economic mismanagement eventually undermine the system. But the attempt itself shows that the Mongols are capable of extremely complex governance, and Kublai Khan's court in Khanbalik, which is modern Beijing, becomes this cosmopolitan center where you can meet people from every part of the known world. Marco Polo is there, assuming his account is genuine. Muslim astronomers are there. Chinese scholars are there. Buddhist monks from Tibet are there. And it's this moment of unprecedented global connectivity, and you can feel the energy of it, the sense that barriers are coming down, and the world is getting smaller, and this connectivity has dark aspects. Diseases spread along with goods and ideas, but it's also genuinely transformative. Gunpowder reaches Europe, printing technology spreads, astronomical knowledge is shared, and these exchanges plant seeds for later developments, like the European Age of Exploration and the Scientific Revolution. And the Mongols don't get credit for this, because they're not directly contributing the innovations, but they're creating the conditions that make exchange possible, and that's a kind of historical contribution that's hard to measure, but real nonetheless. And we're approaching the end of Section 3, and you should understand that we're at the peak of Mongol power. It's the 1270s, the empire has reached its maximum extent. 4 Khanatates ruling over diverse populations from Korea to Kiev. And if you were a betting person looking at the geopolitical situation, you might think this empire will last forever. It controls the Silk Road. It has the world's largest armies. It's adapting and learning from every culture it encounters. But empires don't last forever. Rome didn't. The Han dynasty didn't. And the Mongol Empire is about to demonstrate that rapid expansion creates problems that are harder to solve than the conquest itself. And those problems are starting to appear even now. Succession disputes, conflicts between the Khanates, the challenge of governing settled agricultural civilizations with an administrative system designed for steppe nomads. And in the next section we'll watch these problems intensify until the empire fragments and dissolves. But for now you can rest at the high point, the moment when Mongol power seems unchallengeable, when tribute flows to the great Khan from 3 continents, when the sound of Mongolian spoken in palace courts from Beijing to Baghdad, and when it seems like maybe, just maybe, this empire actually is different, actually has solved the problems that destroyed previous empires, and that hopeful belief makes the coming decline all the more poignant. You find yourself now in the late 13th century, watching an empire that has grown so large it's beginning to forget what held it together in the first place. And this is the paradox of successful empires. They conquer their way into problems that can't be solved by more conquering. And the Mongol Empire is discovering that ruling is harder than raiding, that maintaining infrastructure is less exciting than destroying it, and that the qualities that make you an excellent conqueror don't necessarily translate into effective governance. Though to be fair, the Mongols are trying. They're adapting and learning, and implementing administrative systems that are remarkably sophisticated for a people who were nomadic herders 2 generations ago. And we need to start by understanding how the Mongol Empire actually functions on a day-to-day basis, because the popular image of endless horsemen burning cities doesn't capture the reality of how millions of people are actually governed. The empire is divided into those 4 major khanats we mentioned, and each khanat is subdivided into smaller administrative units, based on the decimal military system, groups of 1,000 families paying taxes to support a 1,000-man military unit, and this creates a direct link between civil administration and military organization. Your tax collector is essentially your recruiting officer, and this system is borrowed from earlier steppe empires and refined through Chinese bureaucratic influence. And at the top of each khanat is the Khan, theoretically subordinate to the Great Khan in China, but increasingly autonomous in practice. And below the Khan is a complex hierarchy of officials with titles like Darugachi, who are essentially governors, and these positions are filled by a mix of ethnic Mongols and locals who've proven their loyalty. And here's where the Mongol pragmatism really shines. They don't care about your ethnicity or religion if you can do the job. Chinese bureaucrats administer Chinese territories. Persian officials run the Persian administration. Russian princes collect tribute from Russian peasants. And as long as everyone sends money and soldiers upward through the system, the Mongols are happy to let you maintain local customs and laws. And this creates an empire that's simultaneously unified and diverse. There's a common military structure and tax system, but local variation in how justice is administered, how markets are regulated, how marriages are arranged, and this flexibility is part of why the empire works at all. You can't impose Mongolian steppe customs on Chinese rice farmers. It just doesn't translate, so you don't even try. And the Yam postal system that we mentioned earlier has expanded into this vast network connecting the entire empire. There are stations every 20 to 30 miles across the main routes, and messengers with proper credentials can get fresh horses, food, and shelter. And this system is used for official communications, military intelligence, and also commercial purposes. Merchants can use the stations if they have the right permits, and this creates an information and transportation network that's unmatched in the medieval world. A message can travel from Beijing to Sarai, on the Volga, in a matter of weeks, which is astonishing by 13th century standards, and the Mongols take the postal system seriously. There are harsh penalties for interfering with messengers, and the stations are maintained even during wartime. And you can see how this administrative infrastructure enables centralized control over vast distances. The Great Khan in China can send orders that reach provincial governors thousands of miles away in reasonable time, and those governors can send back reports about local conditions, tax revenues, potential rebellions. And this information flow is what makes governance possible. And alongside the postal system there's a legal framework. The yasa that Genghis Khan established is supplemented by additional regulations from each subsequent Khan. And while we don't have a complete text of Mongol law, we can reconstruct the basics from various sources. And what emerges is a system that's harsh by modern standards but relatively predictable. Theft above a certain value is punishable by death. Adultery is a serious crime, but religious practices are protected, and commercial disputes have clear arbitration procedures. And there's less arbitrary punishment than under many medieval legal systems. You know what the rules are, even if you don't like them. And for merchants, this predictability is valuable. You can plan long-distance trade routes knowing that Mongol law applies across the entire empire, and that local officials can't just confiscate your goods on a whim. Well, they can, but if you have connections you can appeal to higher authorities, and this legal framework, combined with military security, makes the Silk Road boom. Trade volumes increase dramatically under Mongol rule. Luxury goods flow from China to Europe. Gold and silver flow back, and the Mongols take a cut through customs duties and taxes. And this is an important point. The Mongol Empire isn't just a military occupation. It's an economic system that enriches the ruling class while providing enough stability that subjects can also prosper, at least if they're merchants or landowners. Peasants continue to have a rough time because that's the default state of being a peasant in any medieval society. And in China, Kublai Khan is dealing with the unique challenge of being a Mongol ruler of a Chinese empire, and he makes some interesting choices. He adopts many Chinese imperial traditions, performs Confucian rituals, patronizes Chinese arts and scholarship, but he also maintains Mongol distinctiveness, keeping the Mongol language for official use, preserving the traditional Kurultai system for major decisions, and preventing intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese to maintain ethnic boundaries, and this creates a hybrid system that frustrates both traditional Chinese scholars, who see the Mongols as barbarian usurpers, and Mongol traditionalists, who think Kublai is going native and forgetting his root. And you can see the tension playing out in the Yuan court, where Chinese-style palace intrigue coexists with steppe traditions of horse riding and archery, where Buddhist and Taoist and shamanistic practices all have official recognition, and where the civil service examination system is eventually restored but modified to favor Mongols and Central Asians over ethnic Chinese. And this affirmative action for nomads is deeply unpopular with the Chinese scholar official class, who feel qualified by education and culture but excluded by ethnicity. And this resentment will eventually contribute to the Yuan dynasty's fall. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the late 1200s, the Yuan dynasty is stable and prosperous. Kublai attempts invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, and both fail spectacularly due to typhoons that destroy the Mongol fleets, and the Japanese later call these storms kamikaze, or divine winds, believing they were sent by the gods to protect Japan. And the failed invasions are significant because they represent the limits of Mongol expansion. Some territories are just too difficult or expensive to conquer. Japan, with its maritime approaches and difficult terrain, isn't worth the cost. And Kublai also attempts invasions of Southeast Asia, campaigns into Vietnam and Burma and Java, and these are mixed successes at best. Some territories pay tribute but can't be effectively occupied, and the jungle warfare required is completely alien to Mongol tactical doctrine. You can't do cavalry charges in dense jungle, and attrition from disease is terrible, and eventually these campaigns are abandoned as not cost-effective, and this is smart pragmatism, knowing when to stop expanding. But it also marks the end of Mongol growth. The empire has reached its natural limits, and meanwhile in Persia, the Ilkhanate under Hulagu and his successors is facing different challenges. They're ruling over a sophisticated Islamic civilization with ancient traditions, and initially, the Mongol rulers are religiously Buddhist or shamanistic, which creates tension with Muslim subjects, but over time several Ilkhans convert to Islam, the most notable being Ghazan Khan in 1295. And this conversion is both personal and political. It helps legitimize Mongol rule in Muslim eyes, and Ghazan implements a series of administrative reforms based on Islamic law and Persian bureaucratic traditions, and he's genuinely interested in improving governance, issuing regulations about tax collection, judicial procedures, and agricultural development. And under Ghazan and his successor Oj2, the Ilkhanate experiences a cultural and economic renaissance. Trade flourishes, magnificent buildings are constructed. The Mongol court becomes a patron of Persian literature and Islamic scholarship. And this is another example of the Mongol pattern. Initial destruction followed by support for high culture once they're in charge. And here's a quirky historical detail. The Ulkhans issue one of the first detailed budgets in Islamic history, a complete accounting of state revenues and expenditures across the realm. And this document survives in Rashid al-Din's historical work, and it gives us unprecedented insight into how a medieval state actually functioned financially, how much different provinces paid in taxes, how much the army cost to maintain, how much went to the royal court's expenses, and modern economic historians love this source because this kind of detailed financial data is rare for the medieval period, and what it shows is a state that's economically sophisticated, even while politically unstable, and the instability is the problem. Succession crises plague the Ilkhanate. When a Khan dies, there's often a scramble for power among various claimants, and these disputes weaken the state, and by the 1330s the Ilkhanate is fragmenting into smaller successor states, and in the Golden Horde, which rules the Russian territories, you have a similar pattern of initial exploitation, followed by routinized administration. Russian princes have to travel to the Horde's capital to receive patents confirming their authority. They pay annual tribute called the Mongol exit, and they provide troops when required, but otherwise they're left to govern their own territories, and this system of indirect rule is efficient from the Mongol perspective. They don't need to micromanage every village, they just need to ensure compliance from the princes, and the princes compete with each other for Mongol favor, which is exactly what the Mongols want. Divided Russian principalities can't unite against Mongol rule, and this plays out over decades with different Russian princes traveling to the Horde to denounce their rivals and seek advantages, and it's undignified and bitter, but it works from the Mongol standpoint. And the Golden Horde also converts to Islam in the early 14th century under Ozbeg Khan, which creates its own complications because the subject Russians are Orthodox Christian, but religious tolerance remains official policy, and the Horde grows wealthy on trade, controlling the routes between Asia and Europe, taking customs duties from merchants, and this wealth allows them to maintain their military and political power, even as the connection to the Great Khan in China becomes increasingly nominal, and by the mid-1300s the four Khanates are essentially independent states that happen to share a Mongol heritage. They're no longer a unified empire in any meaningful sense. And here's where we need to talk about the succession crisis in the Yuan dynasty, because it exemplifies the problems that plague all the Khanates. Kublai Khan dies in 1294, and the succession should go to his designated heir, but there are multiple claimants with different support bases, and over the next few decades the Yuan dynasty goes through a rapid turnover of emperors, some reigning only a few years before being deposed or dying, and this political instability undermines effective governance. Officials spend more time on factional politics than administration, taxes aren't collected efficiently, military defense is neglected, and corruption increases because everyone is trying to grab what they can while they can. And the Chinese population, which never fully accepted Mongol rule, becomes increasingly restive. Natural disasters in the 1340s and 1350s, floods and droughts and famines, strain the dynasty's resources, and there's a catastrophic outbreak of plague. The same Black Death that's devastating Europe also hits China, and mortality is enormous, and the combination of natural disaster, disease, political instability, and ethnic resentment creates conditions for rebellion, and rebellions do break out, first small-scale banditry and local uprisings, then larger movements with religious and nationalist components. Secret societies like the White Lotus and the Red Turbans organize resistance, and the Yuan government responds with military force, but they're increasingly ineffective. The army is demoralized, generals are unreliable, and the logistics system that once made the Mongols invincible is breaking down, and you're watching from a distance as an empire that seemed permanent just decades ago starts to crack. And there's scholarly debate about what exactly causes the Yuan dynasty to fall. Is it the succession crises? Is it economic mismanagement? Is it ethnic tensions? Is it natural disasters? And the answer is probably all of the above. Empires rarely fall from a single cause. It's usually a cascade of reinforcing problems. And here's a mainstream historical fact that ties this together. The Yuan dynasty issues so much paper money to finance their operations that they trigger massive inflation. The currency becomes worthless, and merchants refuse to accept it, reverting to barter or using metal coins, and this monetary collapse undermines the commercial economy and the government's ability to pay its soldiers and officials, and it's a perfect example of how technical economic problems can have revolutionary political consequences, and in Persia, the Ilkhanate has already collapsed into successor states by this point. Various local dynasties claiming authority, and the Mongol ruling class is being absorbed into the Persian population through conversion and intermarriage. And the Golden Horde is entering its own period of instability, succession disputes and conflicts with rising regional powers like Lithuania and Muscovy. And the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia is fragmenting between nomadic and settled factions. And what you're witnessing is the end of the Mongol Empire as a unified political entity. It's not a sudden collapse like a building falling down. It's more like gradual dissolution, like sugar dissolving in water. The structure is there, and then it's not, and the process takes decades, and different regions experience it differently. But by the mid-1300s, the age of Mongol unity is clearly over, and yet the legacy persists. The trade routes remain active, Even without centralized Mongol control, the administrative techniques are adopted by successor states, the religious tolerance influences later empires, and the very idea that such a vast empire is possible becomes part of historical consciousness, and future conquerors from Timur to the Mughals to the Manchus will claim Mongol descent or legitimacy, because the Mongol Empire, despite its relatively short duration, casts a very long shadow, and you're feeling the weight of this history, the sense that we're watching something important dissolve, and there's melancholy in it. Regardless of how you feel about Mongol conquests and rule, there's something poignant about the end of any great enterprise, and the Mongols built something unprecedented, and they couldn't maintain it, which is human and universal. Ambition exceeds grasp. Success plants the seeds of failure. The center cannot hold. These are truths that apply to empires and individuals alike. And as Section 4 concludes, you're standing at the transition point between the administrative height of the Mongol Empire and its fragmentation into successor states. You've seen how the Mongols tried to govern their conquests, adapting and learning and implementing sophisticated systems, and you've seen how those systems ultimately couldn't overcome the fundamental challenges of succession, ethnic tension, economic strain, and the simple fact that ruling is harder than conquering. And the next section will trace the final dissolution and the long-term legacy. But for now, rest in this moment of realization, understanding that the Mongol achievement, for all its violence and disruption, was real. The postal systems worked, the trade routes flourished, the legal frameworks provided stability, and millions of people lived their lives under Mongol administration in relative peace. And that's worth acknowledging, even as we prepare to watch it all fall apart. Because history isn't a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's complicated and contradictory, and human. And the Mongol Empire is all of that. Brilliant and terrible, innovative and destructive. A moment when the world became connected in new ways, and paid a terrible price for that connection. And you can feel yourself drifting toward the final section, toward the end of the story, where empires fade, and legacies are debated, and the sound of hooves gradually fades into memory.